few weeks back, a good friend of mine from college called me up and asked if I wanted to spend a week or so with him up at his great-aunt's lake house in the mountains of Virginia. His great-aunt had recently passed away, and the family was still in the process of sorting out the will. However, it was looking pretty certain that the cabin and the surrounding property were going to be sold off fairly soon. Besides, most of the beneficiaries of the will lived halfway across the country, so they were glad to have someone look after the place instead of just leaving it empty. With that in mind, we decided to meet up there and take a few days to unwind, and of course catch up. Now, my friend had told me a few things about this cabin prior to going, and he had warned me that it was a little bit old and run down. I took that in stride, but I was not prepared for just how old and run down it really was. Because, apparently, the building and the surrounding outbuildings had been around since the 40s, well before the river in the valley below had been dammed to create the lake. The cabin was small, but it was still reasonably nice, even if the porch and some of the outbuildings seemed like they would collapse at any moment. The nicest part of this cabin, however, was how sublimely quiet the whole area was. Even though the other end of the lake was heavily developed, the shoreline where the cabin was located was very rocky and mountainous, so there were no other neighborhoods or marinas in the area. In fact, other than the occasional sounds of a particularly loud boat going by in the distance, the wilderness was almost spookily quiet. Almost. It took the better part of the afternoon to air out the musty cabin and to get unpacked. Then the final step was finding somewhere to stow the little John boat I'd brought along. The forecast called for rain during the night, and I had foolishly forgotten the tarp at home. But the old barn seemed just the ticket for storing the boat. I backed the trailer over to the barn, but when I went to roll open the sturdy double doors, I found them bound together by a heavy steel chain and the biggest padlock I'd ever seen. I also noticed that there were two large and fairly new 4x4 timbers bolted onto the exterior walls of the barn to keep the main doors from rolling open. That was definitely strange, sure, but considering the ramshackle condition of the barn, I figured the boards and chains were probably just meant to keep anyone from going inside the unsafe structure. A safety precaution. I figured I would just back the boat into the wood shed instead, but just as I turned away from the barn, I heard a rustling inside. It wouldn't have been out of the ordinary at all, except for the fact that it seemed to be coming from high up in the barn, well above where your average rat would be hiding. I pressed my ear to the door of the barn for a few moments, but the rustling didn't come again. However, if I listened closely, I could hear breathing. It was like the breathing of a goat or a sheep or even a small calf. It was slow and steady, and it was certainly stronger than the shallow and sharp breaths of a rat or a squirrel. My curiosity was piqued. I then pressed my eye to the thin slit in between the two barn doors, trying to get a glimpse of whatever was inside. I could not see anything within, except for a few beams of light slanting in through holes and openings in the barn's upper structure. But then, I was jolted away from my concentration by the sound of my friend's voice from up by the cabin, asking me if I needed some help. "No thanks, man. I've got it," I called back before taking one last look at the barn and getting back in the truck. By the time I cleaned out a spot in another one of the outbuildings and got the boat trailer inside, the sun was starting to sink below the treetops. On top of that, my stomach was beginning to rumble. When I headed back to the cabin, I was elated to find my buddy putting a couple of sandwiches on the freshly cleaned kitchen table. As we ate our simple but satisfying dinner, I told him about the odd sounds I'd heard coming from inside the barn. He shrugged, said it was probably just a raccoon or possum. Made sense to me, I guess, but when I mentioned the boards and the lock and the chain on the doors, a more quizzical look crossed his face. That's weird. I found almost the exact same thing done to the attic door here in the house, he said, gesturing towards the other end of the room. I got up from the table and walked over to the rickety staircase, and sure enough, the trapdoor at the top of the stairs was covered with 3 fresh 2x4 boards, and the latch was bound with a heavy-duty padlock. Of course, the cabin wasn't in much better condition than the barn, and the plaster ceiling had several holes in it that showed through to the attic. So maybe that was the reason for the boards and the lock. Our conversation soon moved on to other subjects, and before long we had forgotten the strange locked doors entirely. We stayed up for about 2 more hours, catching up with one another and laying out our fishing supplies for the next day. Finally, though, we both decided to call it a night, since we had planned to get up early the next day and head out onto the lake. There was only 1 bedroom in the house, so I opted to take the couch. And in the calm silence of the isolated cabin, it didn't take me too long to drift off to sleep. My rest was not peaceful, however. All night long, I experienced nightmare after nightmare. I dreamt of mazes and dark woods, of claws and fangs and men without faces, never once waking from my sleep, but instead simply tumbling from one dream to the next. When I woke up early the next day, I was exhausted. I felt as though I had run a marathon in the night rather than sleeping at all, and as I brewed a cup of coffee for the morning, my friend shambled into the kitchen. It was apparent that he had also slept poorly. "Did you by chance have a bunch of weird dreams last night?" I asked as he rubbed his eyes in the morning light. You too?" He answered and asked me in return. I nodded, and we both resolved that maybe it had just been something we had eaten the night before. Once we both had our dose of caffeine for the morning, we packed up our gear and put the boat in the water. However, as I walked by the old barn on the way to the water's edge, I couldn't help but stop and press my ear to the boards again. The sound of breathing was still there, but this time it was slower, more gentle, like an animal that was sleeping quite soundly. I quickly made my way down to the boat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about everything around the old cabin. Nevertheless, we spent the whole day fishing and swimming and motoring around the lake, so the nightmares and boarded-up doors were soon far from my mind. In fact, we stayed out on the lake well into the evening, and by the time we returned to the cove with the cabin, it was dark enough that we needed to use a flashlight to dock. As we were unpacking all of our fishing gear and life jackets from the boat, I suddenly became aware of a strange new sound mixed in with the constant backdrop of peeping frogs and chattering cicadas. It was the sound of flapping wings. Now, we had spooked a few large blue herons around the lake that day, and several great gray owls make their home on the family farm, but this sound was not like either of those. It was bigger. I stood there and listened as the sound made slow circles around the cove, but whenever I pointed my flashlight into the air, I saw nothing but the tops of pines and poplars. "Hey, what's going on?" my friend asked, looking up at me from the boat. "Shh, do you hear that? What on earth is that?" I whispered back. He stopped and listened, and he gradually developed the same confused expression as me. "It's probably just a heron, dude. Stop worrying so much," he said with less than complete certainty. I listened to the flapping as it circled for a few more moments, but finally I decided to take my friend's advice and just stop worrying about it. I headed inside, but between getting such little rest last night and an exhausting day on the lake, my buddy and I both soon felt our eyelids getting heavy. So we said goodnight and headed off to bed. Despite my borderline exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. I lay there on the couch, tossing and turning, simply staring at the ceiling above me. As I lay there awake, thinking about the events of the day, I was basically jerked out of my thoughts by the sudden thunk of something hitting the roof. I figured that maybe an old dead branch had tumbled down onto the roof, as the wind had picked up a little outside, and there was even thunder in the distance. But soon I also heard a scrabbling, scratching sound. It was coming from the attic above me. I laid there, stone still, listening as the scratching came in little bursts and waves. As though something was taking its time and picking its way through the attic. The scratching grew closer and closer, eventually sounding as though it were practically right above my head. But after a momentary pause, it began moving back in the other direction. However, in the darkness of the cabin, I could not make out anything through the holes in the ceiling, except for an occasional flash of movement. As unsettling as the whole thing was, I kept telling myself to stay calm. It was probably just a squirrel or something like that. But then I remembered the flapping sound from earlier, and I decided it was well worth trying to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight from the floor and quietly moved in the direction of the scratching, following it through the small kitchen area and down the hallway towards the room where my friend was staying. Every few seconds, I would click the flashlight on for a moment, shining it at the ceiling and trying to catch a glimpse of something through the numerous holes and cracks of the ceiling. Finally, the scratching made its way beyond the door to where my friend was sleeping, and not wanting to disturb him, I figured I would just head back and try to get some sleep. Again, I didn't have much to go on, so I had to assume it was some rodent. Luckily though, or perhaps very unluckily, something in the back of my mind made me turn towards the door to the bedroom again. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any trace of scraping or scratching. But instead, I heard something more familiar. A deep, heavy breathing that I'd heard in the barn the day before. Before you ask, I'm certain it wasn't the breathing of my friend in his bed, because I could hear that too, breathing and rustling beneath the sheets. But this other sound was the breathing of a medium-sized animal, deep and steady and voluminous. If you've ever worked around cows or horses, you know just the sound I'm talking about. Likewise, as I listened, I heard my friend begin to breathe more erratically, and his tossing and turning grew wilder, more agitated, as though he were having a very active nightmare. I could no longer contain my frightened curiosity, so I eased the door open as slowly and quietly as I could, creating a roughly 6-inch crack to peer into the dimly moonlit room. To my horror, I could see the vague silhouette of a long, thin object hanging down from the ceiling just above my friend's bed as he tossed and turned, contorting himself in his sleep, as though he was trying to avoid the touch of some unseen attacker. Initially, I was worried that the dangling silhouette might be a snake, trailing itself down from the attic and onto my unsuspecting friend. However, when I turned on my flashlight and illuminated the room, what I saw was much, much worse. The slender shadow above my friend was not a snake. Instead, it was a long, glistening, pinkish tongue. Above my friend's bed, protruding through one of the many holes in the worn-out ceiling, was a slender snout covered in fur the color of rust and lined with thin, leathery, brownish-black lips. "Oh!" A terrified shout and a few choice expletives sprang uncontrollably from my mouth before I could cover it, and I took an involuntary step backwards, recoiling in disgust and shock. Thanks to my sudden outburst, my friend woke with a start, only to utter a scream of his own upon seeing the grotesque creature above him. He clambered back across the bed, pressing himself against the wall at the head of the bed. The tongue quickly began to retract back up to the ceiling, while a cacophony of squeaking and scratching echoed from the ceiling above. As the tongue slithered back into the protruding maw, the snout quickly disappeared, back through the hole in the ceiling. Immediately, the scratching from earlier resumed and began to make its way quickly back through the attic above us. Snapping himself out of his shocked stupor, my friend sprang from the bed, running past me and into the kitchen. He grabbed a broom and began whacking and beating at the ceiling, following that scratching along its path toward the front of the house. I followed him as he began to beat upon the ceiling. I shined the flashlight upwards, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was through the holes and slits in the decrepit ceiling. Then, to our great dismay, the handle of the broom went clean through the ceiling in the middle of the living room. His efforts were rewarded with a surprised shriek and a chorus of panicked scratching and skittering from the attic above, informing us that he had made contact with the thing in the attic. Our excitement was short-lived, as the scratching noise was quickly overpowered by the groan of old wood and the crumpling of ancient plaster. Chips and chunks of the plaster ceiling began to fall. A few seconds later, an enormous section of the rotten planking fell through into the living room floor directly in front of us, bringing the very unwelcome guest with it. I angled the flashlight into the dusty mass on the floor, and what I saw in the midst of the rubble was not something that I will ever forget. Lying there, scrambling to reorient itself, was a creature that most closely resembled a bat. However, it was far larger than any bat I'd ever heard of. Its body was the size of a large dog, and although its wings were curled close to its body at the moment, they would likely have been 5 or 6 feet across when fully spread, if I had to guess. Its entire body was covered in the same rust-red fur that carpeted its long snout, and its eyes were bulbous and glassy, squinting in discomfort against the bright assault of my flashlight. Its mouth bore no teeth, but the fingers at the joints of its wings had formidable claws. It squeaked and hissed furiously, swinging the tip of one wing at my friend as it pulled itself free of the debris on the ground. At that point, I came to my senses and remembered my .44 Magnum was in the cab of the truck outside. I shouted to him that I had to get it before dashing out of the side door. I retrieved my revolver in a hurry when I heard the shattering of glass from the cabin behind me. My friend was shouting in a panic. I ran back toward the front of the house only to see the shadowy shape of that creature lifting off from the porch next to a freshly broken window, climbing rapidly into the night sky. If I looked closely, I could track its shape across the blue-black velvet of the sky, but it was far too high and moving way too fast to get a shot off at. At least it was gone. My friend and I took a moment to assess the situation, and he quickly made the decision to burn down the old barn. He believed that that was where the thing, or perhaps things, must have been hiding and living. All of the buildings would be destroyed by whatever developer bought the land anyway, so nobody would be out of anything as far as we could tell. Besides, I wasn't about to argue with him after the night we just had, I silently spread fuel oil around the base of the barn. Once everything was packed into the trucks, we ignited the volatile mixture and wordlessly walked to our vehicles, listening closely for any sounds of wings in the air above us. Finally, when the massive barn was suitably ablaze, my friend called 911 to report a lightning strike and subsequent fire. Then the two of us quickly got on our way before the wail of distant sirens grew too close. I've done a plethora of research on just what it was that we saw that night, but I've never found a good explanation. The animal's looks and features most closely matched that of a fruit bat, with its long, toothless snout and extending tongue. But no fruit bat anywhere around the world reaches anything close in size to what we witnessed. If it was in fact an herbivorous fruit bat, what was it doing perched above my friend's bed? And are the nightmares we both experienced connected to it in any way? More importantly, was it a lone freak of nature, or was it just one member of a larger colony? Were the barn and attic boarded up to keep it out, or were they failed attempts to keep it in? I have plenty of lingering questions about what we saw that night, but I doubt I'll get any answers. The one thing I can say for certain about the whole ordeal is that that thing, it's still out there, because it flew off into the night. So God knows where it ended up. Who knows where it's making its home now?